Welcome back. Today we're actually going to talk about anaerobic respiration, which requires no oxygen at all, and it is actually a primitive form of cellular respiration, but it also results in some delicious food. All right, so first, explain the importance of cell respiration. Take a second, do that. Hopefully you explain the fact that cell respiration is important because you're taking the food molecules you eat and converting them into usable energy. But what about anaerobic respiration? It's also called fermentation. Now, fermentation you could think about using for all of our cooking wines and vinegar and soy sauce and anything that is fermented. I know there's kombucha, which is a fermented tea. You can make yogurt through this anaerobic respiration. You make a bunch of cheeses, some delicious stuff, especially bread. Okay, so it's considered very primitive, meaning it's very basic. It doesn't really involve a lot. It's not a convoluted process, and it doesn't require oxygen. So there are two different forms of anaerobic respiration slash fermentation. You have alcoholic fermentation, and you also have lactic acid fermentation. Judging by the pictures, take a guess at what we're going to be talking about, and then later in the lecture, we are going to explore. So take a second, describe the types of organisms that may go through anaerobic respiration. Remember, I said it's a primitive and basic process. So what you're looking at in that picture is actually yeast. Yeast go through alcoholic fermentation, and this is how we get our wines, our beers. We even get breads from yeast. And then you have bacteria, which is lactic acid fermentation, and this is where we're going to get our yogurts and cheeses. Humans actually go through lactic acid fermentation, and I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. So take some time and copy down this little chart. Essentially, it all comes down to glucose. It comes down to that molecule that needs to get converted so we can get a little bit of ATP out of it. So in lactic acid fermentation, you're going to end up getting two lactic acid molecules and two ATP. In alcoholic fermentation, you're going to end up with two alcohol molecules, two carbon dioxide molecules, and two ATP. And if you remember, this is so inefficient compared to aerobic respiration, which results in a total of 36 ATP. This is only resulting in two. So I kind of just answered the next question. How does anaerobic respiration compare to aerobic respiration? Sorry for answering before I even asked it, but anaerobic respiration results in 2 ATP. Aerobic respiration results in 36. So just to reiterate myself, anaerobic respiration is inefficient. Okay, but if you think about it, simple, primitive organisms don't require high amounts of energy like we do because we're awesome. Alcoholic fermentation, performed by organisms such as yeast, starts with glycolysis. That glucose plus the 2 ATP get converted into 2 pyruvic acids or pyruvates, and we're going to get 4 ATP before the final product is produced. The final formula, if you really think about it, by the end, you're going to end up taking glucose, converting it to 2 alcohol plus 2 carbon dioxide molecules and 2 ATP. Now, in processes of making alcohol, you're going to take that alcohol and use it. In terms of bread, if you were to cut raw bread dough open, you're going to see pockets, which were actually made by the CO2 building up inside the bread because it couldn't escape. And inside that pocket, you're going to see a little bit of liquid, and that liquid is pure alcohol. But when you bake the bread, all that alcohol burns off. Now, yeast is actually a member of the kingdom fungi that performs alcoholic fermentation. So it's actually going to take the sugar and it's going to use that as its major molecule that it's going to break down, and you're going to end up with CO2 and alcohol. Lactic acid fermentation, on the other hand, is used by some bacteria and our muscle cells. How many of you have ever done any activity and you felt that little bit of burn in your muscle? That's lactic acid building and building and building up in your muscle cells. Now, the problem is that our body is going to start doing lactic acid fermentation when we can't get enough oxygen into our body. So imagine pushing yourself far, 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 far into working out, and all of a sudden you find yourself like gasping for air. At that point, if you continue to push yourself, you're going to start to feel your muscles burn like never before. Now, it's the same product. You're going to take glucose plus 2 ATP. It forms 2 pyruvic acids and 4 ATP before the final products are made. And in the end, you're going to end up taking glucose to produce 2 lactic acid molecules and 2 ATP. Now, again, I'm not going to be testing you or quizzing you on these concepts, but I do want you to know that this is a less efficient form of respiration, and our bodies actually do this when we can't get enough oxygen. Now, you can thank lactic acid fermentation for creating yogurt. Bacterium is added to milk, which is going to break down the milk sugar known as lactose, and you're going to have lactic acid fermentation. So take a moment and explain, just to review, the major differences between alcoholic fermentation and lactic acid fermentation. Basically, they're both the same. The only difference is that one is producing lactic acid and the other one is producing alcohol and carbon dioxide, but they're both going to result in 2 ATP. Now, why don't you take a second, or more than a second, and try this little activity. Try and write your name 10 times fast. I know I wrote 10 times there, but you may require more before your hand starts to burn or your wrist starts to burn. Try it all the way until your hand starts to hurt and burn. That's when you're going to start to realize all that lactic acid started to build up. So happens in our muscle cells when we don't have enough oxygen there, and lactic acid is actually toxic to our cells, which is why you feel that burn. That's your body telling you you're no longer in homeostasis. Chill out, take a breather, and you're going to get better. So oxygen drives the electron transport chain. So when oxygen is not present, aerobic respiration stops, and you're going to have lactic acid fermentation take over in our body to make a little bit of ATP as a last-ditch survival effort. And some of the thanks or everyday products that we get from lactic acid fermentation or alcoholic fermentation include cheeses and yogurts, beer and wine, Japanese miso, which is just fermented soybeans, soy sauce, and any bread that rises. I hope you found this informative and come to class with any questions you have.